Tonight I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Robinson Wally Fulweiler. Wally completed her PhD research at the Graduate School of Oceanography at the University of Rhode Island in 2007 and went on to do a postdoc at Louisiana State University. Since 2008, she has been at Boston University, where she is a biogeochemist and ecosystems ecologist, whose research is focused on answering fundamental questions about energy flow and biogeochemical cycling of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and silica, carbon, and oxygen in a variety of environments. Her research has included coastal watershed mass balances of major biogenetic elements in New England, the biogeochemistry of nitrogen in coastal marine ecosystems, especially sediments, and wetland ecology in coastal Louisiana. Her recent focus has been on how climate change may influence the nitrogen cycle in estuarine and shelf systems and how anthropomorphic impacts alter coastal nutrient cycles. So please help me welcome Dr. Fulweiler.
So, the immortal life of nitrogen. The reason I have titled this talk The Immortal Life of Nitrogen is A, to try to fill the room when you say you're talking about nitrogen. If I was talking about humpback whales, like this fine beast right here, it would be much easier. But nitrogen tends to have a bad rap. In part, it deserves this rap, and in part, it doesn't. It's a very interesting element, and I hope to share that interest with you today. So James Johnstone wrote a beautiful book called The Conditions of Life in the Sea. And in it, he wrote that the atoms of nitrogen are bound on the wheel of change and ceaselessly pass through living and non-living phases. And I like this, and I wish that scientists wrote like this more often. And I like it because it perfectly describes why I consider nitrogen to be an immortal element. And it is because once it becomes in our biosphere, once it makes that great leap from the atmosphere to the biosphere, and we'll talk about that, it becomes an element that gets cycled over and over and over again. And each time it changes form and moves from one ecosystem to another, it has a profound impact on that ecosystem. And that's what we're going to explore today. So first, where did nitrogen come from? We're not going to go into the chemical details, although I'm happy to talk about it later if you would like. But just know that nitrogen came from the stars. It came from big bursts and stellar nuclear synthesis many, many millions of years ago. From this beginning, it is no wonder then that it is an integral part of everything in the biosphere. Nitrogen is the reason you and I are here today. It is the reason that plants are here. It is the reason that there is a beautiful humpback whale, tons of people and plants. Without nitrogen, none of this would be possible. In fact, it's so important. It's at the very fundamental level of both our DNA and RNA. And so if you have blue eyes or ears that are attached to your neck, or however that works, right, that all has a foundation in DNA, and that DNA has a foundation in nitrogen. So that fundamental part is very important. If we were to examine all the pools of nitrogen on Earth, it's a little bit counterintuitive as to where the important pools are. So most of the nitrogen on Earth is in the atmosphere, and then there's a large component in the mantle, another component in the crust, and then this little sliver here we can break out into this larger pie to show nitrogen in the ocean, soils, and in the marine biosphere. But don't let this fool you. Just because this is a tiny, tiny sliver doesn't mean that it's not important. In fact, this tiny sliver here is the most important part of the nitrogen, and it's the nitrogen, the part of the story that we're going to focus on today. So there's got to be a little bit of a language discussion, and that is there's two sort of words I need you to keep in mind. The first is that there's two types of nitrogen. There's biologically usable, and then there's biologically unusable. All right? So biologically usable we call reactive nitrogen, or NR, and into it falls things like ammonium and nitrite and nitrate. How many gardeners are in the room? Okay, good. So you're all familiar with these terms, correct? In the unreactive pool of nitrogen, so all of these right here can be used by things like plants and whales and people. In this unreactive pool, we have dinitrogen gas, or N2 gas. It is 80% of our atmosphere. And this dinitrogen gas is called unusable or not biologically reactive because we say most organisms on Earth can't use it. And that's really the tricky part and why there are these stars here. And I don't actually like these terms of biologically reactive versus unreactive, because it turns out that even though 99% of organisms on Earth cannot fix nitrogen, there are, of course, some organisms that can, all right? So it gets confusing, but just remember that here, when we talk about reactive nitrogen, we're talking about things like ammonium, nitrite, and nitrate, the stuff you put on your garden. And when we talk about unreactive nitrogen, we're talking about that big pool that surrounds us every day in our atmosphere. The organisms that can fix N2 or take this dinitrogen gas and break apart the triple bonds and put it into a usable form of nitrogen into ammonium are called nitrogen fixers or diazotrophs, and they include things like legumes, peanuts and peas, as well as cyanobacteria, and here I've posted a favorite of trichodesmium. Okay? So just remember that most organisms on Earth can't tap into this big pool of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Only a few organisms can. So far, so good? Okay. In nitrogen fixation, like I said, this is N2 going to ammonium. So why does this matter and what is important here? It turns out that if we want to grow food, and all of you gardeners know this, we're going to need nitrogen. And we already said that nitrogen is important for plants and people and flowers and whales. And it's very important for all crops. And here I've shown one of our dominant crops, certainly in the world, maize or corn. And trying to figure out how to grow corn and how to figure out how to get the most out of crops, farmers long ago began having this discussion. This man here is a man by the name of Liebig, and he was sort of the father of fertilizer. He said if you want to grow more crops, you need to have certain elements. And his idea is called Liebig's law of the minimum. And the idea here, we could look at it like this neat bucket. The idea is that you can only grow so much as to whatever you're going to be limited by, or whatever's in least supply. So if you were trying to carry a lot of water in this bucket or this barrel, you could only carry as much water as this lower slot would hold, right? And think of this could be nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever it is. Another way to think about this is you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? So you might have all the things you need to grow, water and sunlight and potassium and phosphorus, but if you run out of nitrogen, then you cannot grow any more food. And this becomes particularly important because nitrogen is very much a social element. And the reason that nitrogen has been changed and altered so much has to do with us. So this is one of my most favorite photographs I've ever found. This is a mountain. Looks pretty mountainous, correct? These are men. This is a mountain made of guano. Okay? It's all bird guano. And this is important because this was a giant source of nitrogen fertilizer for much of the world for a certain period of time. So when Liebig began to say, hey, you know what? If we have more of a certain element, and this element might be nitrogen or might be phosphorus, it was debated at that time. If we have more of a certain element, then we can grow more crops, which is good. So people began to go to places that they had large stock-ups or build-ups of nitrogen or fertilizer material. And the perfect place for that are islands like these off the coast of Peru. These are arid islands, and they have been visited for many, many years by birds. The birds go out to the Peru upwelling, which is very productive. They eat a large amount of fish. They come back, they nest, and they build these giant mountains of guano. This guano was then excavated and brought back throughout the entire world. So, in fact, in 1824, the first 2 caskets were delivered to the American farmer in Baltimore. In 1840, the first shipment happened from Lima to England. And then between 1840 to 1870, there was an export of guano from around Peru in that area of up to 600,000 tons per year. A huge amount of nitrogen that was coming and being brought into the world, all to increase the productivity of farm fields throughout the world. But as you can imagine, how long it took for that mountain of guano to build up, it was so much more quickly depleted. And in fact, by the 1880s, this was really no longer a viable way of getting fertilizer. So how many of you know the Malthusian Catastrophe? Right? He was kind of a depressing guy. And what he said was, well, we're in for it. He published many editions, 6 editions. He published them. Yes, he published many of them. We won't get into that story. So the Malthusian Catastrophe, what he said was that the world was going to run out of the ability to feed its population. And with that, bad, terrible things were going to happen. And there wasn't any Twitter, and there wasn't any Facebook or CNN, right, or whatever news you may watch, but there was his essay, and there were newspapers, and this was the talk of the town. And people, if it had been on Twitter, it would have gotten many, many hits, all right? This was a depressing fact that people were generally very concerned about. It was so much sort of into the culture of the society that you all, I'm sure, are familiar with The Christmas Carol, right, written by Charles Dickens. And in it, Scrooge, the grumpy old man, says, if they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. Nice, right? And he was talking about poor people, and the reason he was saying that was because there was these ideas floating around that we didn't have enough food and that we were going to, have a major problem trying to feed the population. And so what he was saying, his sort of cultural comment at that time was, well, maybe the poor people can die. I know, he is not nice. Yes?
What was the birth rate at that time?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. Okay, so what happened? This is Sir William Crookes, and he addressed the British Royal Society of Science, and in it he said we have a wheat problem. Same idea that Scrooge was talking about, same idea that Malthus was talking about. And he said, we are drawing on Earth's capital, and our drafts will not be perpetually honored. It is a quote that we could use today, actually. But in this particular time, he was talking about the fact that we were using up guano, we still had a lot of people, and we were needing to deal with this food problem. So what happens? This man, Fritz Haber, who won a Nobel Prize in 1918, discovered how to fix nitrogen. So all of a sudden, on July 2nd, 1909, he became another organism that learned to fix nitrogen. He became a diazotroph, all right? He couldn't do it biologically. That would be a neat feat. But what he did do was learn in his lab that under high temperature and high pressure and with an iron catalyst, he could take N2 in the atmosphere and turn it into ammonia. And when he did it, he had people come watch him so he could prove it, right? Because there was no YouTube or videos, right? So he had to prove it. And he did this on July 2nd. July 3rd, he wrote a letter signed by the witnesses to his boss to say, look at this, I have learned to fix nitrogen. And in doing so, he learned how to tap into that pool and potentially solve this nitrogen problem by being able to take this unreactive pool and turn it into a reactive one that then maybe plants could use and we could grow crops. However, doing this on the lab bench obviously was very slow and cumbersome and needed to be able to scaled up. So along comes this man, Carl Bosch. And very, very quickly, Carl Bosch learned to make this industrial. So he learned to take that neat lab bench experiment and turn it into a large scale so that we could begin to mass produce fertilizer. And with it, mass produce food. So I said this already, high temperature, high pressure, iron catalyst, you can combine hydrogen and nitrogen into ammonia, thereby allowing humans to become or to join a select group of organisms that can fix nitrogen. With that, and this could go back here, there has been a huge increase in the amount of nitrogen fertilizer used over the last 150 years. And this is particularly important for everybody in this room. So if we were to look at a nitrogen budget in the past, okay, nitrogen could come from basically lightning and those types of organisms we talked about before, the nitrogen fixers, legumes, some organisms and cyanobacteria in the ocean. We could cultivate it, okay? So in 1860, if we wanted to make nitrogen, we could cultivate the different crops to do it. We were burning some fossil fuels, but not a lot. And what became known as the Haber-Bosch process had not yet been invented. So if you were to look at the reactive nitrogen pool cycling in the biosphere, there was about 15 teragrams of nitrogen per year. Today, or 2000, we cultivate a lot more nitrogen fixers, we burn a ton more fossil fuels, and we have way more nitrogen now because of the Haber-Bosch process. So we took the total nitrogen from 15 teragrams of nitrogen per year to 165. I want to gasp from you. That is 1,000% increase. Does anyone know how much we've increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Percentage-wise? Dr. Heiss, you know. Yep, about 35%, okay? So we've seen major changes by that, and we should be worried about it and concerned about it, but that is a much smaller percentage than this 1,000% increase in the amount of nitrogen cycling in the biosphere that we've done over the last 100 years or so. How are we doing? Yep.
So this is reactive nitrogen.
Reactive nitrogen, because this Bosch process takes it from the atmosphere, turns it into ammonium. takes it from unreactive to reactive. Good. Okay. So then let's think about the greatest inventions of the last 150 or so years. Maybe the telephone, okay, that would be a good one. Maybe penicillin, or flights, or the internet on flights, all very impressive. But all of those things we could just remove completely and we would still be here. Maybe not all of us if we had penicillin issue, but for the most part, we could remove all of these inventions and the world would basically still be the same. Right? You can survive, as painful as it seems, without the internet, okay? In 2000, or close to that, in 1999, Vaclav Smil wrote about the nitrogen and Haber-Bosch process. And he wrote about it in terms of what was the greatest invention of the last century. And he said it's the Haber-Bosch process is the most influential invention because it detonated the population explosion. So let me be more specific on that. 50% of the global population is alive today because of the Haber-Bosch process. So we could remove half of you in this audience right now. The other way to think about it is half of the nitrogen in your body right now comes from nitrogen fixed through the Haber-Bosch process. So we owe Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch our lives. And we owe the condition of the world and the 7 billion people on this planet, right? 3.5 billion of them would not be here today without this invention. So this has had a huge impact. And this is a busy slide, and all it's showing you is that if you want to follow the percentage, this dotted line, the percentage of the world population that relies on nitrogen fertilizer fixed through this process, we're almost at 50%. So there's an issue. And the issue is that nitrogen causes many negative consequences once it gets into the environment. And that's because it doesn't stay put. I have heard it called a promiscuous molecule, okay? It cascades through the environment, going from one form to another, and each time changing and impacting the environment that it interacts with. So we're not going to go through all of these different portions because it's way too much for this talk, but just know that you can think of nitrogen as a shapeshifter, that it might be a gas that gets fixed through the Haber-Bosch process and maybe gets laid down on a cornfield to feed that corn. And then it could get eaten by us, and we could excrete waste, and that waste can go downstream and fuel a phytoplankton bloom. We'll talk about this. And then it could be converted into a gas or a particulate form or a dissolved form, and it cycles over and over and over again. So each time it gets in the system, you see that it could go from crop to animal to soil back to crop, or it could go into surface waters, or it could go up into gases. And so each time, it doesn't just come in as ammonium and stay as ammonium. It gets moved and fluidly passed from one sort of phase into another. So here is our Liebig bucket again, right? And in that bucket, I'm going to put nitrogen in here because it turns out on ecologically meaningful timescales, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient for marine systems, okay? So it's the element that is least supply that is limiting how much phytoplankton can bloom. And phytoplankton, like this one here, are grass of the sea, right? These small microscopic plants that support all of the food webs we care about, whether you like to eat fish or you're into whales. They all started with nitrogen and phytoplankton and moved up from there. The issue, of course, becomes when we begin to overload the system with this, what happens? And what happens are profound ecosystem changes for aquatic systems. So for example, here we see this large macroalgae bloom where this is not normal. If you see this, that's not normal. That happens because there's an excess amount of nutrients in the environment. Once you get something like this, a big buildup of organic matter, then you begin to lead to downstream ecosystem changes like this fish kill. So let's step through that a little bit. When you increase the amount of organic matter in a system, it's called eutrophication. And you could hear this term a lot if you are on the EPA website or listening to water quality issues. And that's what this means, an increase in the supply of organic matter to a system. And there's a variety of ways to do that, but the most common way is to increase the amount of nutrients that are available and grow phytoplankton or macroalgae. And in marine systems, again, we consider nitrogen to be the reason this happens. So let's sort of step through how this works. And this is a slide taken from one of my PhD students. So in the beginning, right, in a nice coastal shallow embayment, here it is, let's say, I don't know, 100 years ago. And you have submerged aquatic vegetation like eelgrass growing, and you have some small phytoplankton, and there's lots of oxygen around. And the sun comes out, and everything photosynthesizes, and things are good. And then let's say we come along and we build a house and we have a septic tank, and our septic tank's not totally efficient, and it's going to spew some nitrogen into the environment. And that's going to cause this increase in the amount of organic matter, or more production, through phytoplankton, but also through macroalgae blooms. As more nitrogen comes in, more macroalgae blooms happen, more organic matter gets made, and in time it's going to die and senesce, and when it does, it's going to fall to the bottom. And then it has to get eaten and decomposed. And the first process that does that is aerobic decomposition, and it uses up the oxygen. And what happens then is any organisms that are in this path, right, that can't get away from the low oxygen condition are going to be in trouble. And we can have two types of low oxygen conditions. You can have low oxygen, which is hypoxia, or you could reach anoxia, which is no oxygen. These areas are often called dead zones, and some of the most common ones you think of are like the Baltic or the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? And this is all the same process, basically, that's driving it. Baltic's a little bit different, but the Gulf of Mexico is all being driven by this process. So again, nitrogen comes in, you change the system, you grow lots of organic matter, it falls to the bottom, bacteria decompose it, they use up the oxygen, and then you have these low oxygen conditions. If you are a creature that cannot swim or move away quickly, you're trapped here, and then you essentially suffocate and die. If you are able to move away, even being exposed to these conditions can cause issues like changes in reproductive status, feeding ability, and that kind of thing. So there's a big laundry list of depressing things that happen when we have too much nitrogen in the environment. Increased algal productivity, harmful algal blooms, things like red tide, right, toxin-producing algal blooms, nuisance algal mats like those shown here, low oxygen conditions, fish kills for both fin and shellfish, losses of biodiversity, and loss of submerged aquatic vegetation. Are you depressed yet? Okay. Perfect. No, I'm just kidding. So, how is this related back to us? Well, if we look at the global distribution of low oxygen conditions in the environment, you see each of these little black dots here on this map is showing you where low oxygen conditions occur. And they happen to be in places where there's high population density, right? So we see a lot up here in Europe, along the east coast of the US, here in Japan, right? So where you tend to have a lot of people, you tend to have a lot of nitrogen. And that leads to this cascading effect of negative consequences in marine systems. There's another thing, before we get out of our depressing mode, there's another thing to think about, and that is that systems that are exposed to more nitrogen tend to produce more nitrous oxide, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. So you have carbon dioxide here, methane here, and nitrous oxide here, and they all have this familiar sort of hockey stick format or shape. And what it's showing you is that when we began the Industrial Revolution, people began burning fossil fuels, we began fixing nitrogen, and the population exploded, you end up having a lot more greenhouse gases. Why does nitrous oxide matter? It's 300 times more powerful than CO2 with global warming potential, and it's also the #1 contributor to the ozone depletion. Okay? So more nitrogen leads to not only negative effects like low oxygen and loss of biodiversity, but also to increased outputs of nitrous oxide. Powerful greenhouse gas, #1 depleter of ozone. Okay? Now you can be depressed. All right. So our million-dollar question then is this. The million-dollar question is, how do we feed this ever-growing population and yet protect our environment from excess nitrogen? You solve this, you will get a Nobel Prize. Okay? So for the students in the audience, you can do it. There are different ways of thinking about this and different levels of thinking about this. We could go from a pretty large scale, and we could increase fertilizer use efficiency. And crop growing and farmers have actually gotten much better at this, and there's still more improvement that can happen. So we can do things like determine how much nitrogen to put down and when to put it down, and more carefully. That would be good. You'd save money. Additionally, that excess nitrogen wouldn't run off from farm fields into streams and rivers and into the ocean. We could do neat things by trying to increase plant nitrogen use efficiency. So just like us, plants are not perfect at absorbing all of the nutrients that are given to them. And if we could figure out a way to modify a plant so that it would take up more of the nitrogen it was given, then you could put down less nitrogen, and that would help solve this problem. Another sort of large-scale way of looking at this is we could augment the natural process of denitrification. I didn't mention this to you, but know that there's a natural filtering mechanism that bacteria do called denitrification, and it takes nitrate, a biologically reactive form of nitrogen, and turns it into N2 gas. It takes it and puts it back into the atmosphere. If we could figure out ways to augment when that happens, where that happens, then we could increase this natural filtering capacity. Additionally, your wastewater treatment plants have the ability through tertiary treatment to shift and remove nitrogen they actually incorporate denitrification then into the process of wastewater treatment. It's really expensive. It's one of the reasons why it's not used more often. So those are kind of large scale, big picture things as to what you could do. But what about us? Because maybe you will go increase plant use nitrogen efficiency, and that would be wonderful. But if not, when we leave this room, what are some of the things we can do? And I'm pretty sure you've heard them all before, but they bear repeating. So the number one thing is don't be a Bigfoot. And I'm particularly here talking about this. The number one way to lower your nitrogen footprint, okay, is to eat less meat. You don't have to become a vegetarian, just eat less meat overall. So here is a global sort of heat map of meat consumption in the world, and you can see that the US and Australia are really head-to-head over who eats more meat, okay? And we can look at this in a different way, where we look at the consumption, average meat consumption per year per person, going from around 40 kilograms in Japan to 125 per capita in the US. We eat way more meat than we need. Yep. In this particular one, it's consuming all meat is just thrown in here: chicken, pork, cow. Okay. So if we eat less meat, this is one way to do it. One way to do it, because since we are not perfectly metabolically balanced, every time we excrete, we put nitrogen into the environment. So if you're eating more protein, you are going to be excreting more nitrogen. Additionally, we have to think about where the meat comes from, and we have to step back a little bit on that. So humans apply about 170 million metric tons of nitrogen to cropland each year. If you want to think about that in terms of whales, right, that's the equivalent of more than 1.5 million blue whales worth of nitrogen we put on crops, okay? That's a lot of nitrogen. Only 12% of it actually enters our mouths. Whoa, 12%. That means we lose a huge amount of it along the way. So think of it this way. It takes about 220 pounds of nitrogen in corn to produce 11 pounds of nitrogen in beef. That is not a good conversion ratio. So it's not that you have to become totally vegetarian, but just every time you cut back on meat, you will lessen your contribution to this process. It's also becoming very trendy. So right now in Hollywood, there's something called Meatless Mondays, and stars are doing it. So, you know, I don't know, maybe you'll meet Kim Kardashian. I don't know if she does it. I have no idea. But there's the idea. Even one day a week could make a big difference. The other thing that you probably intuitively know is that we can reduce the use of fossil fuels. I say this fully knowing that I was late today and drove over here, and I'm so mad at myself, right? Because it's so easy to jump in our car. But especially in a city like Boston, where we have plenty of public transportation and we have bikes and we can walk, we should definitely be able to reduce our fossil fuel use. The reason this matters is because when you burn fossil fuels, you release NOxes, right, nitric oxides or nitrous oxides, and that becomes a form of nitrogen floating in the environment or above us that can then be deposited in different areas. And so this map here shows you a change in the amount of nitrogen, reactive nitrogen, deposited over time from 1860 to early 1990s, and then projected to 2050. And you can see that there's greens and yellows. We get a big orange spot here in the early 1990s, and by 2050 there's going to be huge amounts of nitrogen deposited. And that nitrogen can work its way into the biosphere and lead to some of those negative consequences we talked about. So what do you do? If you want to figure out how you stack up, there is this wonderful tool called the Nitrogen Footprint Calculator, or nprint.org. And this is the US average, and this was mine that I did recently. And you can see that my major issue is transportation, and that's because I flew a bunch this year, and that hikes your nitrogen footprint up. But I encourage you to go to this website and play around with it, because it's kind of an interesting tool to see your particular nitrogen footprint, and then to play around with things like, oh, if I ate meat, only 5 times a month instead of 30 times, what would happen? And you can see that actual number spit out at you, which is kind of nice. Additionally, if you want to know more, I've written a bunch of essays on the Naked Scientist website. The Naked Scientist website, I'll put a plug in just in general. They unzip science for the public to tell you all about complicated science things in non-complicated ways, and they are wonderful. And I have some nitrogen essays on there. Additionally, there's this great reactive nitrogen cycle website where you can go and click around and figure out different percentages and where the nitrogen comes from and where it goes. And there's that endprint calculator. And then finally, if you're interested in any of the work I do, which I didn't talk about today, you can go to our website, follow us on Twitter or Facebook, or feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer your questions. I am also happy to answer your questions right now. Thank you. Yeah, so that's a great interesting and hotly debated topic. So when we talk about limiting nutrients in the ocean, we can think about them on different timescales. When we talk about it's like a mini biogeochemical lecture. I apologize, but bear with me. So when we talk about that, we say that nitrogen is sort of this one on ecologically or biologically meaningful timescales, our lifetimes. If we think really big, long-term glacial periods, then phosphorus might be the limiting nutrient. However, there are certain parts of the ocean, they're known as HNLC areas, or high nitrate, low chlorophyll, where they've got tons of nitrogen. And so everyone says, well, they should be blooming a lot, right, and making lots of phytoplankton and sucking down CO2. And they're not. And so there has been lots of debate as to why these areas have this nitrate but aren't being productive and making phytoplankton. And there was a man who stood up one day and said this great, at a conference, no scientists say things like this. He got up and he said, give me a tanker full of iron and I will give you an ice age. And he meant that iron was the nutrient that was limiting. And when you add all this iron, you're going to get a huge phytoplankton bloom. As they photosynthesize, they're going to take CO2 from the atmosphere, put it into their biomass. They're going to die and take all that CO2 to the bottom of the ocean, lowering our carbon dioxide, lowering our temperature. Hence the ice age. The reason he thought that was because he had done a bunch of laboratory experiments where he showed that sort of water and phytoplankton populations from these regions, when you added iron, they would grow. And there's other work too where you look downstream of volcanoes where lots of iron comes out that can sort of that then show increased phytoplankton after the volcano emissions hit the water. So those are the reasons why. In general, any coastal region that is coming in contact with humans has got plenty of iron, and that's not an issue, and it's nitrogen. So it's just these specific areas in the open ocean that iron might be the one, and that was a long answer. That's an interesting idea. I don't know your answer. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that there's quite a lot of effort placed on trying to figure out how to grow certain phytoplankton species for biofuels. And some of those can be things like cyanobacteria and stuff like that. And so cyanobacteria can also be ones that are harmful, causing issues in the Charles River. So there might be something there. I don't think we're going to get to the point where we're eating those, because the ones that are making toxin, because the toxin they produce can be really quite bad. Kill you, cause brain loss, like amnesia and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's a great question, and so I'll repeat that in case you guys didn't hear. And that was, do we know, if we sort of look at the East Coast or any coastline, can we figure out how much nitrogen is coming from fossil fuels versus agriculture versus sewage? And the answer is yes, we can, and it really varies depending on where you are. So we can just take the US, for example. On the East Coast of the US, so take New England, the nitrogen coming in here is primarily from wastewater treatment plants. You go down to the Chesapeake Bay, and there they have wastewater treatment plants, but they also have a ton of chicken farms, and that's what's dominating. If you go to the Gulf of Mexico and look to what's driving low oxygen conditions in the Gulf of Mexico, that's because the Mississippi River drains 40% of the US, and it's the main agricultural area of the US. So it varies by region. And then if we look sort of on a global picture as to where the nitrogen's coming from humans, a ton of it's coming from fossil fuels, and I want to say fossil fuel burning, industrial plants, mining, that kind of stuff. I want to say that's like a 50%. And then I want to say that agriculture and whatnot, it's probably around another 30%, and then we can break down smaller from there. So one way to deal with this problem, the question was, if septic tanks were more efficient, would the nitrogen get out? Without a doubt, better septic tanks are a great thing to be thinking about. You know, the issue really is that whenever you have waste around or fertilizer around and you add water to it, there's going to be a problem because it provides a mechanism that allows the nitrogen to get out into the environment. And we don't, this is going to be a weird statement, we don't spend enough time thinking about what happens to our waste. So we are all very comfortable with flushing, things disappear, and we go, oh, look at that. See ya. Thank you. I don't have to deal with that, right? But the problem is that someone has to deal with that. And what's happening is the downstream ecosystems are dealing with it. And so there are better ways. So certainly better septic tanks are a good idea, but also a good idea are things like, you know, dry toilets, right, where you don't have water, composting toilets, that kind of thing. There is a long history of trying to use waste from animals and humans as ways to fertilize crops, and there are probably things that we should start thinking about doing because we could go back to that. And there are issues with bacteria and all that, but I think that those can be overcome. So yes, improved septic tanks would be great. Yes, so I like where you're thinking. So your question was, how do we speed up, or can we speed up natural denitrification processes? And that's what my lab indirectly spends a lot of time researching and trying to understand. And that is, what are the ecological and environmental conditions that allow denitrifiers, those things that naturally filter nitrogen out of the environment, to thrive and do their job? And how have humans altered those to sort of decrease that rate of removal? If we can figure those things out, then yes, I think we can. I don't think that's the total answer, because the bottom line is we've got to stop putting all this nitrogen in the environment to begin with. And so one way to do that is to do things like eat less meat, burn less fossil fuels, and then if we could recycle on top of that, that would be great. So in one way, that's good because we're collecting it, and then the idea is we can process it. Before, it could just go into the harbor, right? And the harbor has had a long, I'm sure you all know, a long history of being really, really dirty and has gotten much, much better. And so there's been a lot of work. MWRA has done a lot of work with different people like Ann Giblin and stuff, looking at how the harbor has changed since we've removed the wastewater treatment, and it's much better for the harbor. And so now it's being put off stream. So I would say the bubbles are helping. Well, it changes it for the harbor, for sure. So the harbor is not getting it. And what's happening is it's getting slowed down, so bacterial processes can change it in that bubble and along that tank. It is getting released out into the ocean, with the idea being sort of the famous thing, dilution is the solution. There's a lot of water out there, and so has it helped the harbor? Absolutely. Has it helped the ocean where it's getting dumped into yet? I don't know the answer to that. And I would say that all we've actually done is move the problem sort of downstream again, but I also have not recently heard of, or maybe I'm not up to date on the reading, seen any major consequences of that particular move yet. Doesn't mean, I don't know if I don't want to recommend just putting things out in the ocean. So that's why I'm just going to stop answering that from now. So you don't see it, and I don't see it. So it's kind of like flushing the toilet. It goes away and it's gone. So if you're asking about sort of what's changed in the harbor, if it's better for that, the answer is yes. Because the harbor doesn't receive that nitrogen, and things are looking good. For the downstream ecosystem and what's happening, I think it's yet to be decided. And I think in the end, it just goes back to that problem that we're not addressing, the fact that there's too much nitrogen to begin with. It's money, and it's yeah, so the question is, what's the issue? Why don't we just go to tertiary treatment? And the issue is that it's money, and who is going to pay for it? And typically that burden falls on the taxpayers. And so there are really big and interesting stories right now dealing with nitrogen in Falmouth. There's been interesting stories in Narragansett Bay and Rhode Island dealing with nitrogen there. In some cases, ecosystems get nitrogen and are okay, right? And some ecosystems are not. And I think that in the end, you know, if it's millions and millions of dollars and your annual taxes go up by X percentage, are we collectively as a population willing to bear that cost? In future years, the other cost that's going to, be tough is sort of the ecological cost of trying to do it. So every year that goes by, it gets more and more expensive to do it. Okay, so are there other types of areas where we could sort of move this nitrogen and try to increase phytoproductivity or something like that? So you hit on something important there, and that is that, sort of to go back, that we need nitrogen. It's very important. Primary production phytoplankton add to fish. Without nitrogen, we wouldn't have fish, and that would make us hungry and sad and have other issues up the food web. In typically many of the big areas you're talking about, they're not nitrogen limited, so it would be something like iron that you'd need. So you'd add nitrogen and nothing might really happen. You could also imagine the cost of trying to take nitrogen from Boston and transport it to the South Pacific, or the Southern Ocean, where there's a HNLC area, would be huge. And they already have nitrogen, so that's not the issue. So I think it really gets back to this fact that in the end, we've got to figure out how to reduce the nitrogen we put in the environment, how to reuse what's already there. And I think those are kind of the two things we need to do. Any way to grow crops without nitrogen fertilizer? I think, to my knowledge, no, but I am not an agricultural specialist, but I think nitrogen is sort of one of, there's other ones obviously people put down too. Phosphorus, they're putting silica down now too, so there's others. But nitrogen, once it gets into the environment, then it moves rapidly from that farm field to a river and down into the ocean. I think what we need to do there is help farmers figure out how much nitrogen to put down and when to put it down. Because if we could, if you put down a ton, there's a big rainstorm, you've lost everything, right? So it's bad for your environment and bad for your crops and bad for your budget. So I think learning ways where we could maximize when to put it down and how much to put down. And we have neat tools now, where you can measure the nitrogen content of a leaf and figure out how much they might need and whatnot. And so I think we could sort of, if I were king of the world, that's what I would do. I would try to approach it that way, by figuring out when to use it, how much to use, and really refining that. So corn is a tough one. Corn, people say, maybe it was Michael Pollan who said that corn is the only plant that's domesticated humans, because it's everywhere now, and the reason it's everywhere and grows so much is because of how much care and time and feeding of nitrogen we give it. I think you hit on something really important, and that is that one way to sort of add nitrogen naturally to farm fields, and some farmers do this, is to have a crop rotation. So that you are planting something that might be really nitrogen sort of starving, take up lots of nitrogen from the soil. Maybe the next season you plant something like clover or soybeans or something that allows nitrogen to come back in, and then you plant the crop that needs a lot of nitrogen. And so that kind of crop rotation is certainly an idea that people are doing, and I think it's a good one because of that. Right, because it's doing what it needs to do to get nitrogen, right? Yeah, and so you're not putting down sort of excess amounts to try to increase your crop yield. And the idea often is it's like a cheaper insurance policy. Like, I don't know if my plants are going to grow, so I'm going to add a little bit more nitrogen to them, and hopefully they will.